Okay, then we kick it off. While the others are still joining us, we'll get started. Again, very warm welcome, everyone. I know for many of you, this is already the final sprint towards the year's end. I know at least the people we work in my team, partners, customers, it's the time where it's particularly busy. A lot of people seem to be ill here in Munich just a week after the Oktoberfest. This seems to be a particular problem. So I'm saying, like, we really appreciate you being here today in this year's end sprint, and I'm very much looking forward to today's session with our expert Marc. I'm sure if you are in strategy work, if you are interested in strategy execution, you might have heard of Marc. He has published a lot around the topic of strategy. He, I think, created some super valuable tools and IP like the Business Strategy Canvas. I've been following Marc for a very long time. I think he does a really great job in sharing his knowledge, his tools, his experiences on LinkedIn and on other channels. And you can clearly see he's more than 20 years of experience working with top-level leaders on strategy development and strategy execution. Always, I think, in a very pragmatic way, and very close to the practice, not just the theory. In our space, I know there's like a lot of people who like to talk about like frameworks and methods, and it can get quite academic and theoretical. So I really like to have experts who are really out there, who are traveling the world and work in the strategy rooms, who help huge companies to execute these strategies. And that's what we have with Marc. Marc, you brought a couple of the logos, a couple of the companies you work with. Everyone can see that. Great to have you here. Very much looking forward to the next 40 minutes or so with you. And with that, I'd hand it over right to you.
Thank you, Hans. Yeah, thanks for the invitation and thanks for the warm welcome. Yeah, and so also thank you everybody who joined us today for taking the time. So this is your session, so don't hesitate to ask questions in the comments as we go along. We will also have two word clouds, so two whiteboards where we will invite you to participate a little bit later on. So please take the opportunity and engage, and the more you engage, the more you get out of this session. Now, as Hannes said, so I've been working in strategy for over 2 decades, helping leadership teams of business units, divisions, teams in large corporations do better strategy. And when I actually started working in strategy, I was quite surprised. You know, we learn all these tools and we have all these frameworks, like Johannes said, that we learned about in business school. And I mean, if you're on LinkedIn, many people post all these frameworks and tools. So you would think that we know how strategy works and we are capable of doing good strategies. But then, you know, if we look at the data and we look at studies about how successful strategies really are, then we kind of come to the conclusion that the results show 70 to 90, some studies say 50%, so it varies a little bit by study. But I think the message is clear that most strategy apparently doesn't work anymore, right? So I like talking about old school strategies. So using all these tools or doing strategy the way it has been taught to us in business school, it seems not to work anymore, right? And it's not only the studies or the academics who say so, but if you ask executives, we're not going to go through all the details here, but again, various studies come to various types of numbers, but the conclusion is kind of clear that executives are really concerned about the strategies in their organization. So strategies not being clear enough, not being innovative enough, not being bold enough when it comes to design of the strategy as such, but then also up to almost 80% who say, well, we don't have the resources behind to implement the strategy. The strategy has not been translated into tangible actions. And at the end of the day, there are just too many priorities that our strategy asks us to work on, right? And before we get to the root causes, in my experience, we would like to hear from you. What are your main concerns when it comes to doing strategy. So Lena just share the link in the chat, or you can also scan the QR code here. And we just want to give you a couple of seconds to enter here in this Slido poll. What are your concerns when it comes to strategy? And you might want to think about strategy overall. You can think about the development of strategy. You can think about the execution of strategy. You can think about maybe the updating of strategy. Yeah, so no clear focus, too many priorities, no clear action, feasibility. So kind of similar ideas than what we heard before. So if you have anything else you want to share, more people are typing, I see. Yeah, another one with focus, execution gap. So it goes a little bit in the direction of the feasibility. We also have in the comment poor strategy, formation or design. Yeah, that's something that I talk quite a bit about. That very often, or we focus a lot on execution. A lot of people say, well, strategy is all about execution, and we need to get execution right. And when I started working in strategy, actually, I started with doing execution, so the change management bit of strategy, if you like. And very often we were asked to execute strategies that were bad strategies to begin with, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about this. What is actually a good strategy, bad strategy? You might have heard this term from Richard Robert. But yes, I completely agree. So weak strategies lead to poor execution, I always say, right? So it starts with the design, and having a strategy designed properly is already kind of half of what is really helping them with execution, as we also have here. Another interesting one that I see here is the silos. So very often we think about strategy as being purely market oriented, but what inhibits a good strategy, or what is the problem with strategy, is very often more internal concerns or internal issues, like we have silos and people are not working together, and that's why the strategy is not working. Strategy developed by AI, not humans. Yeah, it's an interesting one as well. So we see more and more AI being used. On the other hand, you might have seen that, I think it was Deloitte who was fined like 400,000. They had to pay back 400,000 because they used AI to generate a report, and the client obviously noticed that it was an AI generated report. So that's maybe so I wouldn't be too worried about strategy developing or AI being developed, being the developer of strategy for the time to come. Too broad, yeah, it's also an interesting one. Yeah, it sounds nice, but people don't know what it means for them at their level. Okay, yeah, cool. So there's a lot of this, going into execution. So strategy as such being too broad, and then how are we going to execute that? So this is exactly what we're gonna talk about. And if you if you look at the research, there's many different research again about why strategies fail, and what's the problem and what are the concerns. And one of the key issues that I have come across, and again that's also been confirmed by research, is that most organizations don't really know how to do good strategy. So there's different ways of looking at that. There is, for example, there is a Harvard Business Review study that says only 8% of leaders are actually effective at both developing and executing strategy. Other research, like the one I cited here, says that 66% of organizations, they lack a coherent set of strategic thinking frameworks. So you don't really have a framework to how to do strategy, and 80% of managers say that they don't really have a process for developing strategy. Now, these are the challenges that you face, right? With obviously all the concerns that you also mentioned before. Now, the question is, what can we do about it, right? If the traditional way of how we do strategy leads to all these problems, what might be a different approach? And what I have developed over my years of working with these companies is what I call the Better Strategy OS. And so my view is that if you want to make a good strategy and execute also a good strategy, you need three things. There are three pillars here. And the first one is that you actually need a clear definition of what is strategy. So if we talk about strategy, what is it that we're actually talking about? Usually, if you ask like 5 leaders in a team, you get 7 different answers about how they think about strategy and what they consider strategy to be, which obviously is an issue, right? And it leads to all these confusions that we have, and the strategy is not clear, and people don't know how to translate it because everybody, if they hear strategy, they have a different picture in mind, right? Second thing you need then is a structured framework for thinking about strategy. So also going back to this research, which says that, well, companies don't have these frameworks. So you need a structured framework to think about strategy, to guide you about what are the key questions that you should actually be asking yourself and thinking about. And last but not least, obviously, you need a systematic process for doing strategy. And if I say do strategy, it's not only the development or the execution, but it's really everything, the development, the execution, but then also the review, the monitoring, the updating that comes thereafter. So we're going to talk about this and see strategy more as an iterative process, and this systematic process for doing strategy kind of incorporates all of that. But let's start with the clear definition. And again, before I jump into one, I just want to hear from you, and we have another Slido here. How do you define strategy? So if you think about strategy now, if you have to explain it to a colleague or a spouse, what would you say? How would you define strategy? And Lena shared again a link here, or you can also scan again the QR code, and we're going to jump into another Slido and see what you come up with. So how do you define strategy? What is strategy to you? The means of getting to a goal. Yeah. That's one that we see very often, on some kind of variation of getting from A to B. If the opposite would be trivial, yeah, so then it's not a strategy, right? So we say often that if the opposite is stupid, then it's not a strategy. Like saying we want to grow by, or we want to grow profitably, and nobody would say we want to shrink unprofitably. So it's kind of like not really a strategy to say we want to grow profitably if the opposite of that doesn't really make sense. Also, the core idea in that sentence is that strategy is about making choices, right? So, and if you make a choice which is not really a choice because the opposite wouldn't be feasible or doesn't make sense, then it's not really a choice actually. But yeah, strategy is about making choices. Yeah. So maybe we can also add a couple of comments around what choices. Wow. Then we have a lot of things about, so competitive. Well, so there might be this notion of competitive advantage, clear intentions, goals, and a plan to get there. So again, this idea from getting from A to B, goals, and defining actions on how to achieve them. Plan, yeah. Time, process of creating a set of activities. Okay, activities. Advantage, yeah, competitive advantage. Compromise, yes. So with the choices, there might be compromises that need to be made. So sometimes we hear people say strategy is also about saying what not to do. Yeah, and then in the comments we have strategy is the answer to the challenge or opportunity that you're solving. Yeah, I like that. We're going to come to that. A way to achieve an objective, vision, mission. Yeah. That's, for example, also very often a discussion. Is vision, mission, goals, are that part of strategy, or is that kind of like an input into your strategy, for example? Right? North, advantage, ambition through choices to value, from ambition through choices to value. Okay, so ambitions, there's choices that need to be made, and then ideally you need to create value. There's teamwork, compromise, we had that already. Compounding, yeah, compounding is interesting. So I guess it's about not pivoting them too much, so you compound and it adds up. I'm going to come back to that a little bit. Star, feet. Maybe you have to explain the feet a little bit in the comments, or what you mean by the feet. Good. So, I mean, there's a lot of that notion of, okay, you need some kind of objectives, whether you call it objectives or you call it mission, vision, your North Star. So there is that kind of direction we want to have. Then I also see a lot of comments around that way to achieve your objectives, how to get there. So the plan, the roadmap, all of these things. And maybe just on the plan, you might have seen this video by Roger Martin, which is quite famous. So if you go to YouTube and you look for a plan, it's not a strategy. So there are some interesting takes on this idea of planning. Something that I would like you to think about is, so if a strategy is a plan to get from A to B, what's the difference between a strategy and a plan? So why do we call something a plan, and why do we call something a strategy? And if we go back to the slides, Lena, here is my take on that. And the difference really between a plan and a strategy is that challenge. So I define strategy as the answer to the challenges you face in achieving your ambitions. Right? So yes, there is this idea of ambitions, and again, it could be your objectives, it could be vision, mission, whatever you want to call that. It could be your purpose. A long time ago, I was really keen on doing purpose, for example, but I learned that, or I had to learn and experience that every organization has its own kind of way how they think about ambitions. So some, they really have a big mission, vision statement. Others are purely financially driven, so they only have financial objectives. Still others, they are more value oriented for what is the value we create for different stakeholders. So I am not dogmatic about that. So I use the term ambitions to talk about all these things, and whatever the organization feels is right for them, we work with that. So again, the big difference between a plan and a strategy is this focus on the challenge. And sometimes I say, if you don't have a challenge, then you actually don't need a strategy. A plan will do. Now, this definition is not new. Actually, it has been in the literature at least, kind of implicit for many years. Richard Rummel made this idea of challenge-based strategy a little bit more popular, like I think it was 15 years ago now, with his book Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. But this is the core essence of strategy. Now, this is also a definition of strategy that is universally true. Right? A lot of the things that we very often hear about when we define strategy, like, competitive advantage, for example, or creating value for customers, they work in the business context. But it's not a universal definition of strategy. Right? And I think we're going to come back to that idea a little bit later. But this definition of strategy, it works always. It works wherever you are in the company. It works for your marketing strategy. It works for your HR strategy. It works for your business strategy. It works for your corporate strategy. And it actually also works outside of business. And in fact, if you read Richard Rummel, a lot of his examples where he talks about this idea of challenge-based strategy, they come from military, they come from politics, they come from national security kind of strategy. So I think that's a good definition of strategy also because it is universally applicable. Now, maybe a word on the challenge. Some people say, well, if you only focus on challenges, maybe that's a little bit too reactive. Right? And I would invite you to think about a challenge not necessarily as a problem, but in a more neutral way. So it could also be about profiting and seizing an opportunity, for example. So the challenge becomes, how are we going to seize that opportunity? Right? And basically, theoretically, you could say that you need a strategy whenever your circumstances change in some kind of way, and you need to actually change what you are currently doing. Now, here's an example, a quick one from Netflix. Now, Netflix has a very clear ambition. So this is taken from their website. So they want to entertain the world by offering best-in-class TV series, documentaries, feature films, and mobile games. A little bit further down on the website, they are also very explicit about what they don't do. Like they say, we don't do user-generated content, for example. We don't do adult movies. So very clear what they do, what they don't do. Now, when they started the company in like 1996, 97, they knew already that streaming would be the next big thing. But the challenge at the time was that the infrastructure was not ready to really have a big streaming business. So they said, if we go into streaming, or the market is not there yet, we're not going to get the funding we need. So we do something different. And that's how they started with DVDs, right? And they wanted to be a little bit different. Again, they didn't have the infrastructure like a Blockbuster. It would have taken years to build that. So they said, well, we're going to compete by shipping DVDs instead of building these stores, but we want to position the company as we entertain the world. Now, the challenge they had with this shipping the DVDs was that it was difficult to become profitable, because in the beginning they didn't have the subscription, but you had to pay by DVD. And the challenge was that, well, we're talking 96, 97 here, so there was no next day delivery. So if you had to ship the DVD by mail, it would take like 2-3 days to arrive at the customer. The customer has a day to watch it and then needs to ship it back. So it's another 2-3 days before the DVD is back at Netflix, and Netflix can rent it out again. So the turnover per DVD was actually once a week, instead of seven times a week every day like Blockbuster could do it. So Netflix had a profitability challenge, and the strategy, how they solved that challenge, was to come up with a subscription, and you could keep the DVD as long as you like because you paid the monthly subscription anyhow. Right? Then, obviously, when streaming became possible, the strategy was to actually shift from DVDs to streaming. In the streaming business, the core challenge is we need to get the content, so they license the content from the large Hollywood studios, pretty much like licensing the DVDs. Then at some point, the competition increased. So studios launched their own streaming services because they saw that you can make money with it. There was more competition for content, so content became more difficult to get to. Other people were competing for the same content, so prices went up. And as a strategy, Netflix started producing its own blockbuster content, like House of Cards was one of the first famous ones. Again, next challenge. Producing own content is very expensive, and you still depend on these big studios. So, as a strategy, also as they were growing internationally, they started to finance, license, and distribute more independent local productions. Right? And maybe as in the last kind of move now to differentiate further from competitors, they are adding the mobile games to the same subscription, which is different than an Apple, for example, where you have to pay for the mobile or for the game subscription separately. So you can see how the Netflix strategy was actually shaped by the changing circumstances, also what is happening around it, and it needed to adapt. So there was no long-term plan to do all these things for the next 10 years, but it was really opportunities that came up, like streaming is becoming possible, challenges like getting content becomes more difficult, and the strategy is all about adjusting to that while keeping this big-term ambition, long-term ambition also, we entertain the world in the focus. So that's the North Star, as some of you called it before, but how to get there is adaptive, and that's what the strategy helps us do. Right? Here's another way to think about it. This is a definition that I came across only recently, but Jack Welch apparently said that strategy is the evolution of a core idea through changing circumstances. So the changing circumstances is your challenges and strategy. So you have that core idea of Netflix streaming, for example, right? But we need to constantly adapt it so that the evolution or the idea keeps on evolving and keeps on adapting to what is happening around you.
Yeah, and I also wanted to ask you on these like different perspectives on strategy. Right, I think there's also quite some people that do focus on the like value orientation. I think there's this other Harvard Business School professor, Felix Oberholzer-G, who says, simplified words maybe, but strategy is basically defining what value do you want to create for the customer in a distinct way or better than your competition. I've seen you engage in discussions about this previously. So is this complementary, or how would you maybe scrutinize that approach to strategy?
Yeah, so I'm not so much a fan of the value stick, to be honest, because I think it's a very economic definition of strategy, or also a very economic view of looking at value, because it's basically, if you're cheaper than what the customer would be, to simplify it, right? But he says there's a value stick, so there is a part of value you create for the customer, there's value you create for the company, and there's value you create for employees, right? And the idea is that if the customer would be willing to pay more, so he talks about willingness to pay, but we charge less, we create value for the company, for the customer. If the employees, if the salary is actually higher than what they would be willing to accept, then we're creating value for the employee. So it's very economic or very financially driven definition of value. So that's a little bit of an issue that I have with that, but maybe that's just me, right? But maybe from a conceptual point of view, I mean, implicitly, he's talking about business strategy, right? He doesn't say so, but this only works for business strategy. Like if you were to apply this definition now to your cybersecurity strategy, it doesn't work anymore. So that's something. And most frameworks actually that you see that we come across is about business strategy. So that's something very important to keep in mind. There are other types of strategy, and we're going to talk about levels of strategy in a minute, that require you to have different frameworks. So that's something very important. And again, you were referencing, or you were talking about all the discussions on LinkedIn, and lots of people share these frameworks and the cheat sheets with, here are the 6 frameworks you need to know about strategy. They are all very good. I'm not questioning that, but they need to be applied on the right strategy level for the right challenge. So that brings me back to the challenge-based definition. So the challenge-based definition, as I said earlier, it's universal. It always works. If then your challenge, your strategic challenge is we need to create value, then something like the value stick might give you a good framework to think about how can we conceptualize value and how can we think about value. If on the other hand, for example, you say, well, our challenge is that we have too much competition, we are in a red ocean and we want to create something different that keeps us out of this red ocean, then blue ocean strategy is a good framework to use. So I would invite you to always start with the challenge-based definition, and then based on the challenge you're facing, you can pick the right concept, like the value stick, like 5 forces or whatever, that helps you solve that particular challenge. Instead of just doing one thing, which, again, it works on the business level, but it's not going to work for your supply chain strategy, for example, right? And this is, again, one of the challenges and one of the problems I see in organizations is that because everybody has a different definition, and depending on where you are in the organization, they make sense or they don't make sense. And you end always up in lots of conversations about, so what are we actually talking about? Somebody said, well, strategy is this. No, somebody says strategy is the value stick. Somebody says, no, strategy is blue ocean. And then you can't really agree, right? And again, the challenge-based definition solves that challenge, and then you can use the framework that's appropriate.
I really understand it, like based on what you shared earlier, as complementary, right? So you say ambitions and challenges, those are like those 2 concepts. So I think a lot of these value arguments you could put into your ambitions, and the values might be different. I would agree with what Alex shared in the chat. Like also for a cybersecurity team, you can define customer value, maybe also internal customer value, ambitions. But I get it that like the challenge level is sort of like the universally applicable level that you can then actually work on as a team.
But so, for example, again, so if you look at Alice, yes, so I'm aligned, right? So the value you create then for your customers, but then the value stick doesn't work any longer because it talks about willingness to pay and willingness to provide. Right? So still difficult, I think. Right?
I mean, you could discuss about like how much are you willing to invest into your cybersecurity, these kind of things. But again, I think it's fair to differentiate between value and challenges. And also we, as much as you in your work, when we do these kind of things with Workpath and how we build our platform, we're very much agnostic. So this green here shows like one of the exemplary tools we provide, which helps teams to have this value and outcome orientation, but it's certainly not the only one. And I think that's the key thing.
Yeah, I would just invite you to pick the right tools for the right context and situation that you have, right? Good. Let me just, so I was talking a lot here about this challenge-based strategy. Now, just want to invite if there are any comments, any aha moments maybe from the audience, any questions you have that we could discuss here based on what I just presented. I'll give you a moment to just see. There's a little bit of a lag, I think, before comments turn up on the platform here. So if you have anything that you would like to discuss, any questions, any comments, then please feel free to drop them into the comments box or the chat. Yeah, I mean, Johannes, going back to the value, talking about or thinking about what is the value you create for different parties, different stakeholders is obviously always a good idea, right? And in one of the books, in Out of Opportunity, we talk a lot about this creating value for all types of stakeholders. If you do design thinking, you always have a look at how desirable is it? Does it make sense for us as the organization? Yeah, Alice. Yes. So thinking about what is the right challenge is obviously a good starting point, right? And there is also lots of thinking behind how do you pick the right challenge to actually focus on, right? And if you ask an organization, so what are the challenges that you have? Obviously, there's going to be lots and lots of things, right? And the question then is also how do you prioritize that? And I have a tool, I call it strategy triage, which is really about thinking about how critical is the challenge for the organization. So does it really threaten the survival of the organization or not? In the short or medium term. So that would be one criteria to look at whether a challenge is more important than maybe another one. Right? Another criteria that I look at a challenge is if whether the challenge impacts the entire organization or only one department. Which again, if it is about the entire organization, then it might be more higher priority than if it's just for one department. Yeah, Kavita, yes, yeah, good. So strategy can't be something that's the opposite of obviously what we want, or if the opposite is stupid, and then it's not really a strategy, and that's kind of like the blah blah, right? Yeah. So then we have these kind of very often also with this comes confusing objectives for strategy, like we want to grow profitably or we want to grow by 10% or things like these, which are nice objectives, but they are not really strategies. Right? Good. If you have more comments, keep them coming. And in the meantime, I'll go on a little here. Now, obviously, every organization faces its own challenges, right? But on the other hand, there is a set of what I would call universal strategic questions, strategic challenges that every organization needs to solve, which brings us to the structured framework for thinking about strategy. So the challenge you need to solve, or the question you need to answer, depends a little bit on what type of strategy, what level of strategy are you actually talking about. Right? So theoretically, we say that there are these 4 levels of strategy. So you have network strategy is more different companies coming together to maybe align their strategies in collaborations and alliances. Then you have corporate strategy. So that's within one company. Which businesses do we actually want to be active in, and how do we want to manage these businesses? A big challenge here is always to decide how much autonomy do we give the businesses versus how much do we look for synergies across our businesses. Right? Then within that company, you have the different businesses, different business units, different business lines. And here the core challenge is how do we compete in these businesses? And as I said, most strategy frameworks that you come across, they operate really on this level. Right? And then on the most granular level in this hierarchy, you have, or in this different levels, I should say, you have functional strategy where you need to contribute then to the business strategy. Right? So 4 different levels, 4 key issues that need to be solved, and 4 different sets of choices that need to be made. So going back to before, this idea of strategy is about making choices, yes, but you have to think about what choices do you need to make, and that's dependent on where on this hierarchy you are and what type of strategy you're talking about. Right? So this alone, so really focusing on the right set of choices will already improve your strategy. And I've seen many companies make mistakes about corporate strategy, confusing corporate and business strategy, wanting to align different businesses and find one strategic positioning, for example, on the corporate level, but different businesses had different dynamics and they needed different business units, or not making. Very often we see if the company is a little bit smaller and it might be growing, there's a lot of confusion between corporate and business strategy. So where you say we need to go into a new business line, or we want to open a new business, for example, but they think more about it on the corporate level and they kind of apply the same thinking throughout, where in reality it would be more of a business strategy discussion to be had, because different dynamics maybe again need different strategies. So this is a very important step in what we call the content of strategy, where you focus on the right issues. And I think WorkPath does that also, or represent this idea in your system, Johannes?
Yeah, I'm wondering, like you talked about corporate and business, also unit level strategy, right? So what are your experiences? How do the actual org structures and functional levels really relate to these different strategy levels? Because what we experience more and more is that
you broke up there a little for me, Johannes. I don't know whether it's the same for all the others.
okay. I'll just try again. So what we experience more and more is that those levels don't perfectly match anymore, right? So we have organizations that realize actually with the strategy we developed here, with the priorities.
What I heard is that the levels don't match. Now I don't know whether it's Johannes breaking
there
up
is
or whether
sometimes
it's me
tension
on my side.
Sometimes a tension between like org structure and these strategy levels. Is that something you've come across as well?
So again, I didn't quite catch everything, but the alignment. Now, so obviously, let me go back here. Ideally, there is some alignment between these different levels, but the type of alignment that's required is also dependent on the choices you make. Like if on the corporate level, your strategy is to give a lot of autonomy to the businesses and not look too much for synergies, then what is the alignment? So then the businesses are basically, in an extreme case, free to do whatever they want. So there is not necessarily that big need between a corporate and a business level. Right? If, on the other hand, on the corporate level, you decide that you're looking for lots of synergies, then obviously the businesses, they have to align to what is decided on the corporate level. So there is a little bit less of that there, I think, or it depends. Is always the answer, right? On the functional level, obviously, yes, you want to align as a maximum to the business strategy. In an ideal case, you have a business strategy before you think about the functional strategy. But that, if you are a functional leader, and I work with many, even if the business strategy is not very clear, that shouldn't keep you from coming up with your functional strategy, because you can always define what's our HR strategy and really think about, so what are the HR challenges for the organization, no matter what the business strategy might be, right? And then focus your functional strategy on that. So yes, in an ideal world, there is this nice hierarchy and the cascading of a strategy from top to bottom. In real life, very often it's a lot messier than that. Right?
Yeah. And I think that has increased, right? The more organizations become more dynamic, sometimes even like these networks.
Right.
I think you need to become more flexible in like applying these kind of templates, and the perfect cascade doesn't exist. And I think you need flexibility in like what is a functional strategy, for example. There I see a lot of organizations struggle if they expect the same format from different functions. While the org structure behind the dynamic of the business, the value creation or the value streams changes. So I think that, loosely coupled is probably what works for both there.
And there again, I'm with the challenge-based definition, because at least that definition works always, right? And obviously then the content for the marketing strategy will be different than the content for the cybersecurity strategy or whatever. But if we align that strategy is there to solve these challenges, that is what, in my experience, really helps organizations actually make progress and move forward. Also, if times are uncertain, because the uncertainty is more about, we hesitate to make decisions because we don't know what's going to happen in 3 years, but you have challenges that you need to solve today. And you still have your North Star, you still have your ambitions. You can work on these challenges no matter whether you know what's going to happen next year or in 2 years.
Makes sense.
Now, about the format, so I have this business strategy canvas. So for the business level, we actually have 4 canvases in the Better Strategy School. So we have network strategy canvas, corporate strategy canvas, we have the business strategy canvas, and we also have a department or functional strategy canvas, where we kind of apply the same logic. I mean, this is not something new. Our thinking behind this is based on Hembrick and Fredrickson, so the strategy diamond, but then the entire picture. It's quite similar to playing to win cascade, for example, where it decides where do we want to compete, how do we compete, what's the supporting organization we need, and what are the strategic moves we need behind. And we apply kind of the same logic on the department level. So department level could also be, instead of where do we compete, we're talking more about, so who are the key stakeholders and what product, solutions, services do we offer them? How do we create value for these stakeholders? So we can, and what is the team, the organization we need, and what are the moves? So you can kind of apply the same thinking also to a department level, and to some extent, as you said, Johannes, have one framework that really works across the entire organization. Good. I want to just show you a brief example also from a client of mine that I have worked with. to illustrate what is a good strategy and how can you apply the stuff that we've been talking about. Now, here was the ambition of this company. So it's a 200 people, kind of 50 million revenues company. It's part of a larger group. It's a media company, so they are in broadcasting. And they wanted to grow their revenues, increase profitability, and this in the next 3 years. Now, the next 3 years was exactly, or actually tied to the challenge. So it's not just because strategy needs to be 3 years that we came up with the 3 years, but the time horizon came from a challenge. Right? And the challenge, a particular challenge that they had was that they thought they were going to lose their big three customers, and these big three customers accounted for 80% of profitability. And they had contracts with these big three, which were about to run out in 3 years. So that's where the 3 years come from. Very often we think about strategy needs to be long-term. The way I think about it is that the time frame of your strategy is tied to the time frame of your challenge or your ambition. Right? If you want to enter a new market in the next 12 months, then you need a strategy for the next 12 months. Right? So in this case, the 3 years, it comes from these contracts running out in 3 years. So as I said, these big three, 80% of profitability, they had not been very successful in getting new big customers, mostly because these big customers, they had their own technology expertise, and the company was more seen as a supplier, but it was not really part of the discussion and not sitting at the table, which made it difficult for them to really clearly position themselves. So the big ones didn't work. They had tried many or getting more smaller customers. So they had many small customers. In fact, it was like over 200, but still 200, and they were only 20% of profitability. So they were not big enough to compensate for the loss of any of the big three customers. Working with these small customers had led to a very broad product portfolio with a lot of customization. The company had a very entrepreneurial culture. So sometimes we want to have that. We think it's good. Well, here the downside is that they did everything for everybody. So they were entrepreneurial in the sense of whenever there is an opportunity, we go for it, without having a clear strategy behind whether it really makes sense. Is that really what we want to do? Is that the direction we want to go into? Right? So, and this had led to a very broad product portfolio, a lot of customization, up to a point where nobody knew anymore what actually a customer had paid for. So there were also lots of services rendered to customers that were not part of the SLAs, and customers didn't pay for them. So which led also to the financial trouble. And because it's as I said, it's a 200-person organization, so very limited resources, and they were spread very thinly across all these different customers and initiatives and products and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, lots of thinking behind, but the strategy was actually quite simple in the sense that we said, well, we're going to focus on medium-sized customers who don't have that tech expertise, and we're going to offer them a standard out-of-the-box integrated solution. So we kind of become the one-stop shop for new medium-sized broadcasting clients. So this is the core idea of the strategy. So you also see that the strategy, it doesn't need to be 200 slides. Now, obviously, there's lots of detail behind how did we come up with that conclusion. So there's good reasons behind. There's trends we looked at that made us think this is the right strategy to go for. But it's also, again, solving the challenges, like too broad product portfolio. So we solved the challenge by offering a standard out-of-the-box solution. Obviously, afterwards, we needed a product development strategy. What does that look like? How do we do it? So all that detail came afterwards. But here is a very clear focus on who are we going to focus on, who are we going to sell to. Again, we defined what does a medium-sized customer look like, what's the minimum revenue that we want to expect, and so on and so forth. And we have a very clear offering. And with that comes the value proposition. Well, it's easy, it's out of the box. It comes with managed services, so you don't need to worry about anything. Because it's standard out of the box, it's also a lower cost, and so on and so forth. Right? So lots of details behind, but this was the core idea. And this is something that everybody in the organization understands. Now, again, there's lots of discussion about, okay, what does that exactly mean for us? How do we align? How do we adjust to that? But at least it's very clear in the sense of here is what we are going to do. So you have the objectives, and you have also how are we going to do that? Well, by focusing on these customers and offering these standard out-of-the-box solutions. And then here is what that looked like on this canvas. So again, something very easy that you can present to the entire team. What's also quite interesting here is, and that goes back to the feasibility, is that we talked about what organization do we need and what are the strategic moves. So as you can see here, a key thing was actually we needed a product-focused organization, more agile ways of working, and that required actually a complete reorganization. And one of the first moves was to have this, called it org design stream here. So we set up a team across the company which worked on exactly what does this new organization look like. So that's also a way of, so it was not top down everything, but here we started engaging the organization in the execution of the strategy, but also in the design of that new organization, the new customer journey as part of that one platform, and also the product development stream. So where we needed to decide on the product strategy that goes behind this. By the way, the product strategy also interesting. So the company, when we started, they were working on 21 different products. And when we went into the strategy discussions, we said that we're going to stop 17 out of the 21 because they would no longer fit with the new strategy. So in terms of what are we not doing, it was a painful discussion. We had to develop lifecycle strategies for each of these products because some customers were still using them. So obviously you can't shut them down from one day to the other. But nevertheless, there was the very clear decision out of 21, we're going to stop 17 products. We're going to stop developing these products in the future because they no longer fit with the strategy. So difficult discussion, but absolutely part of this alignment that is needed in the organization. Good. So much for the content. Now, just briefly onto the process of strategy. Now, I just want to give you a highlights what to maybe also do differently in uncertain times. Now, the traditional way of doing strategy, or we might say it actually strategic planning, looks like this. Right? So it's a very linear process, or it's a cascade from the top to the bottom. What is kind of the core, what is at the core of this approach is the think, then do. So first we need to analyze, we need to develop, we need to plan, and then we go execute. Maybe eventually we're going to monitor. You might see these also as circles, but the logic is still we need to develop, plan, and so on before we go into execution, and then maybe adaptation. Now, what I have seen in my work and also in my PhD research was focusing on this idea of thinking while doing. So just like the example I presented you, we didn't have all the details, but we had a direction. We had an idea, a core idea. So we started working on that. You take action, and then the action is going to give you feedback, what works, what doesn't work, and then you adjust for the next cycle. And as you go through these cycles, your strategy becomes more and more granular, it becomes more detailed, and the quality and also the success of your strategy actually goes up. So this is my view of agile strategy, if you want to call that. But it's really that a mindset which is more strategy as learning than strategy as planning. So you accept that there is uncertainty, you accept that you don't have all the answers, you act nevertheless, you take a couple of steps, you see what works, you solve the first challenges, and once you've done that, you have the next challenge coming up, you get feedback, and then you go through these cycles. Yes, Alan, so it's a little bit like agile sprints, if you like. We actually I work with agile sprints when it comes to strategy execution, where we always focus on what are we going to do the next months, and then we'll see what is required afterwards, because again, stuff changes and things happen that you can't plan for, so we don't bother too much with longer term planning, actually. Which doesn't mean that we don't do financial forecasts over the next 3 years or stuff like that. But again, that's more like the guideposts or the rail guards, if you like. And then in between that, we still have to be flexible about how to get there. So if you want to think about it this way, strategy is really, or strategizing, the process of strategy is really 3 types of activities. Right? So there's always what is the challenge, how should it be addressed, and what actions should be taken to implement that strategy. And I like to talk about always on strategy. So you try to be in that cycle all the time. You review what is working, what is not working all the time, and you adjust accordingly. And obviously this then happens in your business context, in the context of your ambitions, in the context of your bigger strategy, if you like, or your core idea of the strategy.
Yeah.
Johannes, you want to mention something here?
Yeah, in the interest of time, I would just quickly add this complementary view that I mean, obviously, this more iterative approach or agile sprints, how it's been called here as well. I think that makes sense to strengthen on all levels of the organization. I think also here we keep experiencing how important it is to like keep the ambitions present and have like this in a productive interplay, right? I've been part of strategy teams or generally about these like sprint retros where I've seen team like going all over the place, collecting challenges. I think it's always important to be aware and to set the right kind of scope for the right kind of org level and frequency of the meeting that you have here. Are we discussing like output level or challenges on output level ambitions? Are we really discussing like the whole strategy right now? So again, just underlines how important I think it is to keep the ambitions present, because challenges, everyone has tons of challenges all the time. And I think this focus, this is what we experience as quite critical to make the extra effort of more conversations, more like faster moving cycles really work and productive.
Yeah, so yes, so I think the way I think about it is so, and it also goes back a little bit to the comment of Alice. What if ambitions change in the meantime? So I think, in my experience, there are organizations, they don't have any strategy at all, right? So that's kind of like the starting point. So you need that core idea. Then there is organizations that have that core strategy, but they need to tweak it and they need to work on challenges to make it work actually. So a little bit like the Netflix example, right? And then obviously, yeah, once if you change your ambitions, if your context changes completely, then you might need to change your strategy completely. But then again, align and adjust. What are the challenges we are working on? Are they in line with the new ambitions we have or not, right? It's also about, the ambitions. To me, the ambitions should be more longer term, right? So the way I think about it is that you zoom out into the future. So maybe that's the next 5 years, or maybe it's even the next 10 years. What do we want to achieve? And that's kind of the ambition. And then you zoom back into today. So what is the first challenge we need to solve in the next 12 to 18 months to get there, right? And then once we've done that, there is the next challenge. But we keep the ambition as a more longer term North Star, as some of you called it earlier. Right? So I would not go with an ambition only for a year. I would really be longer term, but then the strategy can be the next 12 months and then be flexible and adjust. Right? If you change your ambition all the time and you change your organization all the time, that is something very challenging, I think. And even for small companies, that you have the startups that pivot all the time without maybe necessarily giving one idea time to actually show results and outcomes and have actually an impact. Good. Just to finish it off, so I'm not going to go through all the details here, but the three core steps for me in a strategy process. So I said it's iterative. Obviously, you get to start somewhere, right? And it's always about aligning on current reality. So I don't talk too much about doing strategic analysis, but for me, strategy is always subjective. It's a social kind of endeavor. You always have a leadership team. You have an organization that gets together. And to me, it's important that collectively that team makes sense of what is really going on. How do we interpret? How do we make sense of what is going on? And then align on this is what we think we should be doing. So that's the align on current realities. And what we do here is we look at what is working, what is not working. We look at trends and stuff and try to make sense of all of that. Right? Then designing strategy. So key message here is design a couple of options to test. So maybe like with the media company, this medium-sized customers, that was one option. And we actually tested that before making a decision. So we just called 5 of these ideal customers we wanted to have and say, if we were to do something like this, would you be interested or not? So it could be something very simple. Before then, we made a choice. This is what we actually want to go to. And then I don't talk about executing strategy or implementing strategy. I talk about living your strategy. So and this is the evolution and the adaptation that is kind of built into this. So we activate the strategy, which is really, we need to bring it into the departments. We need to translate it into initiatives. We need to align what the departments do to the overall strategy. And then we need to go into living. So that's having that rhythm of evolution and adaptation of your strategy. If you're interested in learning more about all these things, I've created the Better Strategy School. So it's an online business school, if you like. We have some nearly 500 people now, students. We have different tiers. So if you're interested in learning more about that, getting all the tools, workshop designs, all of that, then I invite you to take a look at makebetterstrategy.com. There's also some free stuff that you can download if you want to have a look at that before you commit, let's say. Good. And with that, Johannes, I think we still have a couple minutes if there is any other questions.
Yes, we tried to close on the hour, but 2 or 3 more minutes we have.
So if you have anything, please put it into the comments. Else, also feel free to reach out on LinkedIn, for example. Do me a DM if you have any questions, and I'll be happy to answer them.
Yes, also from our side, I mean, Marc is easy to reach. Same here through our website, through our email addresses. 1 or 2 more things from Workpath if you want to dive deeper. We recently relaunched a KPI maturity assessment. So if you want to work on like improving the measurability of your strategy, I think that's a great starting point and very simple and free way to get this assessment and some lightweight benchmarks. The most successful piece we've published this year so far is the Guide to Artificial Intelligence in Strategy Execution. So that's maybe also something has been mentioned earlier, right? Mm-hmm. And then we have several more webinars like this in our library. One about what kind of strategic capabilities organizations need to invest in right now. And I think this touches upon a couple of things Marc described today, but also more upcoming expert sessions like the one today with Marc. So if you are interested, make sure to follow us there on LinkedIn. And thank you very much, Marc. Thanks for preparing this. Thanks for hosting. Thanks for this very high level of engagement. I think we really kept the participation and engagement level high up until the last minute. So thanks again. Have a great time towards the year's end sprint, and I hope to see you soon again.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.